One afternoon in the winter of 2015, a 57-year-old woman named Patricia Dare was sleeping on her couch inside of her home in France when the sound of her phone dinging woke her up. Patricia slowly opened her eyes and she felt groggy and confused. She'd been relaxing and watching a movie since she had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, but she realized, she must have dozed off. And so Patricia, she grabbed her phone and she checked her notifications and she saw she had a text message, but from a number that she didn't recognize. And what it said was really weird. It said, quote, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And for a second, Patricia just had no idea what this meant. Couldn't make sense of what this even said. But then she realized there was actually text messages that she had received earlier from this number, and she realized who it was. So the person texting Patricia this strange message was this middle-aged woman named Béranger. About 8 months earlier, Béranger had approached Patricia while she was out in public and told her that she desperately needed Patricia's help. Because, Béranger said, she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. So Patricia, in addition to being a local news reporter, was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium, meaning she basically believed that she had the ability to contact the dead. That was something she was really passionate about. And in fact, she was fairly famous for being a psychic medium in France. So, this request was actually not that bizarre for Patricia. But because of Patricia's status, both because she was, a famous medium and also because she was on the news, she was sort of well known, and it drew a lot of people to her, claiming that they had, paranormal issues, ranging from, thinking they saw a ghost to their house is haunted or whatever. And almost all the time, when Patricia would follow up with some people who claimed they had issues, she would discover that, despite her best efforts, there clearly was nothing going on that was paranormal. There was no dead to talk to. It was just like, drafty windows or a house settling or, just a shadow that looked really eerie or something. So the vast majority of times people approached Patricia, she really didn't take them that seriously. So a couple of months ago, when Béranger had approached Patricia, her reaction to it was basically like, "Oh, your castle's haunted." Yeah, I bet, but she was polite about it, but realistically she didn't believe it was true. But because Béranger was sort of persistent, really demanding help from Patricia, Patricia did give her her phone number sort of to be polite. And then immediately afterwards, Béranger had texted Patricia, and those were the text messages that Patricia had, in the thread, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them. But now, here was Béranger texting her once again with this sort of weird cryptic message, again about this haunting of her castle. And this actually kind of piqued Patricia's interest. And because Patricia did have a day off here, she actually felt inspired to follow up and maybe go check out this castle and see what this haunting was all about. An hour and a half later, Patricia pulled up in front of this small cottage that was on the same property as the castle. She knew from earlier text messages that this cottage was where Béranger actually lived. And so Patricia parked, she got out, she walked up to the front door of the cottage, and she knocked. But nobody answered. And so after a few moments, she tried knocking again, this time a little bit louder, and then the door did open. But it was not Béranger. It was this man, this middle-aged man who looked very confused to be seeing Patricia standing there. And just from the look on his face, Patricia immediately launched into this, explanation of why she was here. "Oh, is Béranger here? I was speaking to her via text message." And the man still, he's looking at her like, "What are you doing here? What's going on?" But then from behind him, out walks Béranger. And when she looked towards the door and she saw Patricia standing there, Béranger was practically weeping. I mean, she was so happy and clearly relieved to see Patricia, and she's just like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming. This is unbelievable. Thank you. Like, we really need your help." And then before Patricia could ask any questions, Béranger pointed to the man that had opened the door for Patricia and seemed so confused. And, at this point, his expression had softened quite a bit. And Béranger said, "This is my husband. This is Remy. And he, too, is so relieved you're here." And so at this point, Patricia, she shook his hand and she smiled at them both and was like, "Yeah, I don't know what I can do for you. Why don't you fill me in? All I know is apparently your castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" And so Béranger, she had to kind of compose herself because she was quite emotional just to see Patricia here. But, after collecting herself, she told Patricia that about a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the caretaker of that castle, and that she had just come along to help. And she said, at first, both of them had been really excited for this opportunity because it came with free housing in this cottage. However, Béranger said that they had only been working here for a couple of weeks when really weird stuff started to happen. Béranger said that she'd be in the castle doing, daily chores, and she would know that she's the only one in the castle. Yet she would suddenly hear what were obvious footsteps of people walking and running around on the upper floors of the castle. And at this point, Remy chimed in and he said, yeah, me too. Like, I've heard those footsteps in the castle when I know it's totally empty. But even stranger than that is Remy said he'd be in the castle and he would hear voices. And not just, people whispering or something like you see in the movies. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs, like in other distant parts of the castle that he couldn't see. And it was terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Béranger tell this story, Patricia was struck by how earnestly they came across. I mean, they definitely were shaken by whatever they experienced inside of that castle. Like, they were genuinely troubled and didn't know what to do about it. I mean, Remy still had this job at the castle. They still had to go in there, but it was becoming like this big issue and they didn't know what to do about it. As Patricia was listening to the couple tell this story, she couldn't help but feel like they were being very honest. They seemed very earnest as they're telling the story. Like, they weren't trying to dramatize. They were trying to relay what amounted to, trauma. They both clearly did not like going in the castle. It was like this thing they had to do due to Remy's job, but they were trapped. They felt like, we don't know what to do here and no one's taking us seriously. But at the same time, Patricia is a veteran, psychic medium, and she's been to numerous house calls, numerous haunted homes, and, many times, the screams people think they hear in their home are like, the sound of wind coming in through an open window, and the footsteps are like, a pet somewhere in the house. So there could easily be, a reasonable justification here, but it seemed apparent that there was enough here that it certainly warranted Patricia actually going to the castle and having a look around. And so she said, okay, let's go over. Let's go see the castle. A few minutes later, Patricia followed Béranger and Remy along this wooded path from the cottage over to the castle. Even from pretty far away, the castle was huge and very intimidating. There were two very tall round towers on either end, and in the middle was a slightly shorter section that was decorated with a bunch of turrets. The castle only had two windows that were visible from the front where they were approaching. And for a second, as Patricia was looking at it, she had this sort of uneasy feeling that the windows were the eyes on the castle and the castle was looking at her. But she shook the feeling off and kept walking along. And a few minutes later, they reached the castle's huge front door. And at this point, Remy pulled out this huge key ring covered in keys, and he unlocked the door. And then he kind of stepped aside and pushed it open, sort of gesturing for Patricia to make her way inside. Now, Patricia was doing her best to be very professional and, not quite buy into the hype, at least not yet. This could be something completely rational. But when Patricia walked into the castle, she found herself inside of this huge empty space called the Great Hall. And the first thing she noticed was really how dark and cold it was inside. I mean, this was a castle, of course, and so that was sort of the atmosphere you'd expect, but this felt like eerie. Like this was not a place you'd want to spend a lot of time. And also, it just felt like the atmosphere was just heavy somehow. Like it really was just a tense place to be. Patricia took a deep breath and kind of centered herself, and then she looked around a bit more closely, and she saw there were a few windows on the back wall, but they were all shut. And then right in front of her was this huge stone staircase. And to her right and to her left, she could see there were long hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of rooms potentially. And so after standing there for a few moments, just kind of taking in the scene, Patricia turned to Béranger and she asked her, she said, okay, so you've heard footsteps, upstairs when this place was empty. Can you tell me what you were doing, in any of the instances where those sounds came through? Like, what were you doing? Do you remember? And Béranger said, actually, yeah, I do remember. The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on the window. And I know I heard people upstairs when I was doing that. And so immediately Patricia is thinking, oh, that could be it. Maybe it was literally the sound the shutters were making that maybe somehow gave Béranger the impression that there were footsteps elsewhere inside of this castle. I mean, everything echoes inside of here. It's this big cavernous space. It was possible. And so Patricia's like, okay, well, let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if maybe that is causing some strange sounds in your home. And Béranger and Remy did not seem remotely offended by this. If anything, they were like eager to find a rational explanation for whatever it was they were experiencing. And so quickly, they, along with Patricia, walked over to one of the windows, and Patricia reached out and she opened up the shutters and then shut the shutters and then did it a few more times. But there were no strange sounds. There certainly were no sounds of footsteps running around inside of the castle. Like, there was no way that the shutters were making sounds that you could confuse for footsteps. Like, this was not it. However, Patricia decided she would, just in case, try another shutter. See if maybe one of the other shutters made strange sounds, just to confirm really this is not the case. But as she reached for this other shutter, before she even touched it, there was this loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound that echoed all through the castle from upstairs, and then it just went deadly silent. And immediately the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood up. I mean, this was like an unmistakable sound. And Patricia, she turns to Remy and Béranger, and they're obviously spooked. I mean, they've experienced stuff like this, but this is still just so terrifying. And Patricia, she's standing there not even sure what to do, but then she tells herself, like, wait a minute. That couldn't have been what we thought it was. There's no way that was like some screech coming from some ghost upstairs. Like, there has to be a logical explanation here. And part of the reason she was thinking this is even in, her time as a psychic medium, nothing this visceral had ever happened in her career. Something like that was out of a movie, like literally a ghost screeching upstairs. And so Patricia turns to the couple and she's like, look, obviously I heard that too, but let's not rule out that could have been the wind or something. Let's not jump to conclusions here, okay? Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic, let's just search the castle and see what we're up against. And so the couple, Remy and Béranger, they did not seem reassured, but they kind of nodded along like, whatever you say. But then, like before anyone could do anything else, there was another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream coming from somewhere else upstairs. A different voice is now screaming upstairs. And then it went deadly silent again, and then it was very clear to Patricia, and certainly to the couple, that this castle might just be haunted. There's something going on here that is not right. However, as Patricia is standing there kind of trying to get her bearings of like what she should even suggest they do, because suddenly she is like the expert in charge of the response here, before she could even think, she had this very powerful feeling come over her that she would sort of describe as like a pull. It was like a magnet was pulling her in the direction of these screams. Like she felt like she needed to go upstairs to the second floor to wherever those screams came from. She had to. And it wasn't even clear if this was like her channeling her psychic medium powers. It was like the castle was pulling her deeper and deeper inside of the structure. And so without even telling Remy and Béranger what she was doing, Patricia just kind of silently turned and began walking almost against her will towards that stone staircase that went up to the upper levels. And now at this point, the castle is deadly silent. All you can hear is the sound of their footsteps as they're making their way over towards the staircase. And, Remy and Béranger, they're so frightened. They're just, tucked up right behind Patricia, following her along, not even sure what they should be doing. And so upstairs they went, and Patricia, again, she's got like this intense feeling that she has to go upstairs. She can't even control it. And so up the stairs she goes. No one's talking. All they hear is the sound of the footsteps on the staircase. And up they go, all the way up to the third floor, which is, where these screams were likely coming from. And at that point, Patricia, almost on instinct, turned left and began walking down this long hallway with all these doors that were shut along the way. And again, the castle is just deadly quiet. All you can hear are their footsteps. And down the hallway they go, all the way to a dead end where there is a single room that is shut at the very end of the hallway. And at this point, Patricia, almost like without even thinking, she turns and kind of almost aggressively says to Remy, "Get your keys out and open this door." Like she didn't even know why she was being aggressive. It was like just coming through her. But Béranger at this point, she chimes in and says, the owner of the castle, they told us this is the one room we're not allowed to go in. We've never been inside of here. We can't go in here. Patricia, she just looks at Béranger and says, I don't care. We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room. And so at this point, Béranger, she looks at her husband, and Remy kind of shrugged. I mean, they didn't even know what they're supposed to do at this point, but they figured, all right, she's the expert. Let's let her go in. And so Remy, he pulled out his big set of keys and he fumbled through them all. And Patricia, she's rearing to go in this room. She can't even understand why she feels this way. And Remy, he reaches over, he turns the lock, he pushes the door open, and Patricia walks inside. Now, as soon as this door opened up, Remy and Béranger got a look inside of this room. And it was unremarkable. It was like a vacant room. There was nothing inside of it. Like, there was no clear reason why this room was off limits per the owner. But as they watched Patricia walk to the middle of the room, sort of slowly and methodically, and come to a stop right in the middle with her back to them, they could have sworn they heard whispers suddenly picking up inside of this room, even though there's nobody else in there but Patricia. And then Patricia, who by this point was sort of, freaking out Béranger and Remy, she was acting just very different than when she had first arrived. She just stood there in this sort of bizarre way, just like rigid, staring towards the back of this room as these whispers are kind of going on in this dark room. And then from the threshold, Béranger and Remy watched as Patricia, who has not turned around yet or anything, she just began to twitch, like her shoulders were moving around funny and her neck was snapping in a strange direction. And then she began letting out this just awful croaking sound, this constant, like, single tone croaking sound. And it went on for so long that you'd think she would have need to take in a breath to then continue this croaking sound, but she didn't. It just went on and on and on, just emanating from her body. And, Remy and Béranger, they're terrified at this point for a host of reasons, but really it's now Patricia that's scaring them the most. And Patricia, as she's twitching and croaking, she suddenly stops and whips around and looks at the couple, and her mouth is open, like her jaw is slack, and this croaking sound is still coming out of her, but clearly she's also weeping. Tears are coming down her face. Now, Remy and Béranger, they are beyond terrified at this point for so many reasons, but they clearly know some kind of crisis is unfolding with Patricia, and they want to help her, and they were about to ask her, like, what can we do? Like, what's going on? When there's this loud slamming sound somewhere else in the castle on one of the lower levels. It sounded like a door slamming shut, but really loud. And it was like the noise snapped Patricia out of whatever trance she was in, and suddenly she became really focused. And then instead of communicating with the couple, she just bolted right past them, sprinted down the hallway, and ran down the stairs, like she was chasing after the sound that had just been made somewhere downstairs. And so Remy and Béranger, they're like, what else can we do but follow her? And so they run down the hallway, several, lengths behind Patricia, who's somewhere downstairs, and they get down to the second floor, the couple does, and they can hear the sound of movement in one of the rooms down the hallway. And then they hear this loud, animalistic yelling sound that appears to be, Patricia yelling or growling or something somewhere in one of these rooms. And so they make their way in that direction, and they see there's this open door that leads into a bedroom, and then there's a bathroom off the bedroom. They go in and they look in that bathroom, and there's Patricia, and her back is to them, and she's on her knees, and she's visibly weeping, and she's looking up at something in the room. She was kind of at an angle where they could see her face, and her face is contorted just in horror, and she's seeing something in the bathroom that is just completely terrifying her, but there's nothing in the bathroom. And so Remy and Béranger, they walk in there and they grab Patricia, who did not want to leave, but they drag her out of the bathroom, they stand her up, and they literally forcibly remove her from the castle. Several hours later, Béranger and Remy were back inside of their cottage, sitting in their living room with all these papers scattered in front of them on their coffee table. And next to them was Patricia, who by this point, she was basically back to normal, but she was still very shaken up by what happened in the castle. And also by this point, she was able to explain to the couple what had happened, from her perspective in the castle. She basically told them that she did basically, go into a trance. She had a psychic medium experience, but she had never had anything like this before. This was visceral. This was way beyond anything she had ever experienced in her entire career. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked room on the third floor of the castle, the forbidden room, the room was not empty. When she went in there, she had that calling to go in there. And as soon as the door opened, what she saw was a room filled with people, with basically entities, ghosts, if you will. Béranger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. And she said all these entities were wearing different clothes, like from different time periods. There were people in medieval peasant outfits, and there were people wearing Victorian dresses, and there were people wearing, very modern 20th century business suits. But that really wasn't the initial impression that Patricia got. That was just something she noticed. What she immediately picked up on when she was called into that room and saw these entities is how lost and sort of scared these ghosts seemed, like they were in trouble. And Patricia, she said, she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then felt kind of anchored there. And as she stood there, these ghosts basically began crowding in on her, like they were trying to get her help by getting closer to her. But she felt like overcome with this almost claustrophobic feeling of being suffocated by their sadness, not even by their physical presence. It was like their loneliness and desperation was like washing over her. And it was so awful, it made her weep. And then eventually, Patricia said she was able to kind of force her body to whip around and look at least in the direction of the exit, because she wanted to leave at this point. And it was at that point that, she's making this groaning sound, which she didn't even recall. And she hears this loud slamming sound, which was the door slamming downstairs. And that kind of spooked the entities away from her, and she was able to bolt from the room. And Patricia said when she got out into the hallway and basically began maneuvering in the direction of the slammed door, because again, she had this intense sense of being pulled in the direction of this noise, she said it felt very different than when she had been pulled up to the third floor. She said now, in retrospect, when she had been pulled up there, what she was being pulled by didn't seem malevolent. It seemed, neutral or maybe even positive. But as soon as she was going in the direction of this slammed door down on the second floor, she said it felt totally different. There was obviously like a dark presence, like something bad was pulling her towards them. But still, almost against her will, she ran down the hallway, she went down the stairs, and she made her way into that bedroom, with Béranger and Remy following closely behind. And Patricia said she eventually turned and went into this bathroom in this bedroom. And when she went in there, she saw something that was so terrifying, she just fell to her knees and began to scream. That was that like animalistic wailing sound that the couple heard. What she saw was this enormous, tall, just like dark figure. It was a ghost of this tall man of sorts with like these deep scars all over his face. And he was wearing this rusted chainmail armor, like he was from a different time. And he just seemed evil, like a dark, dark presence. And she knew that was the feeling she was getting. It was coming from this ghost. And it was only because Remy and Béranger came in and basically pulled her away that she thinks she even survived. Like she was being pulled to her death. Like that's the way it felt. But again, fortunately, she's pulled out of the castle. They go back to the cottage. Patricia, had her chance to calm down. And now the three of them were trying to basically decipher what just happened. Like what can we take from this unbelievable story that Patricia has told us and what they witnessed? And what they quickly settled on was, we have a lot that we can begin to explore here, but let's focus on that evil entity, that tall man in the rusted chainmail armor. Who was that? And what did he want? So she and Remy, in the hours since they had escaped the castle, had gathered up a bunch of their historical documents about the castle and laid them out on the coffee table, and they had begun going through them to try to learn about this guy. And at some point, as they were looking through all these documents, there was one particular section that, for whatever reason, just drew, Patricia's attention. She just thought, I want to look at that. And it was the section about a knight whose name was Jean, who had lived in the 14th century. And the document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, which was a conflict between England and France that had started in the mid-1300s. And during that war, the castle was used as a French military fortress. And Jean was killed during a battle at the castle. And so after Patricia read this out loud to Béranger and Remy, Patricia said she just had this feeling that the evil spirit, the tall man in the armor she saw in the bathroom that scared her so much, she had a feeling that, she didn't know why, but that seemed like Jean. However, even if Patricia had been right that this evil spirit she encountered was Jean, they still didn't know, like, why he was there, or why he had appeared, and why he had called her to the room, or why any of this stuff had happened. Like, the whole thing really was unexplained here. Or, who were the other ghosts who were up on the third floor, that apparently Patricia saw? Like, none of it made any more sense. At some point, Béranger asked Patricia, like, what do you think? What does all this mean? Like, why did this happen? What do you think? But Patricia, she really was still very shaken up by this. I mean, she was this, renowned psychic medium, but again, she had never had an experience like this. I mean, this was really terrifying. And she just was like, look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about this. I need to process what's happened here. And so, obviously Remy and Béranger, they couldn't really protest, but they also were like, man, I really don't want to be left here alone with this horrifying castle, but, you do what you got to do. And Patricia, she got up and she left. After Patricia left, Béranger and Remy both agreed that, despite the fact that Remy was the groundskeeper here and did need to look after the castle, that for now, it was just too dangerous to go in there. It was not worth it, and so they would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could get to the bottom of this. And for a couple of days, with Remy and Béranger staying away from the castle, like, they had normal lives. I mean, nothing strange happened at all. They just basically lived in their cottage and went about their lives, sort of keeping the castle over here. But after a couple of days, when still Patricia had not come back again, she was still at her home, still processing this whole thing, Béranger started having this weird feeling in her chest. It was like this need to go to the castle, not dissimilar from how Patricia had described, like, this overwhelming sense of being pulled up to the third floor when she was describing her whole encounter, her whole experience. Béranger, she tried to act like this wasn't happening to her, but she couldn't deny it. It's like she just had this feeling of, I gotta go to the castle, I gotta go over there. And then one day, Remy looked out the window of the cottage and he sees his wife, Béranger, walking right towards the front door of this castle. And he's thinking, there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed not to go in. Like, what is she doing? And he literally ran over there and grabbed her and pulled her back before she went into the castle, which is exactly what she was going to do. And then when she was pulled away, she couldn't even describe why she was over there. She's like, I don't even know. I just felt like I had to come over here. I can't explain it. But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened over these few days after the incident with Patricia. Because shortly after, Béranger almost walked back into the castle, a man had come on the castle grounds. This random man sort of wandered on to the castle grounds and was apparently being drawn, although he kind of framed it differently. He didn't really know why he was there, but he was drawn towards the castle. And as he's walking towards this castle, a deer presumably was also being drawn to the castle, and the deer went running towards the castle and actually rammed into this man and hurt him badly enough he had to be hospitalized. He actually lost an eye from being hit by this deer. And so after this happened, even though, Béranger and Remy were trying to respect Patricia, sort of giving herself some space here, because she hadn't come back, she hadn't been in touch, at this point they were like, we have to get in touch with her. Like, she's the only other person who understands how serious this is. And so Béranger called Patricia and she said, like, whatever's going on in the castle, whatever dark energy is existing in there, it's getting stronger. Now, at first, Patricia was not inclined to come back. I mean, there was a reason she had not been in touch with them since she had left. She had basically decided, like, I don't want this in my life. This is terrifying. I don't know what happened, but I don't want this in my life. But she could just tell that, Béranger and Remy, I mean, they were at their wits' end here and they didn't know what to do. They were lost and they were turning to Patricia more like a friend, like, hey, please come back here and support us and help us get through this. And so Patricia did agree to go back. And so sure enough, the following evening, Béranger, Remy, and Patricia were back inside the castle in the second floor bathroom where Patricia had been found at the end of that horrible experience, looking up at what she believes now was Jean's ghost, this terrifying entity. And so they're in this bathroom, and Patricia had come in here in order to basically attempt an exorcism. And so she's standing in this bathroom, and sort of behind her is Béranger and Remy, and they're kind of holding each other, and Béranger is so scared she's shaking, and they're watching as Patricia, despite her own fears, she was very calm, and she was standing there with her eyes shut, and she was sort of trying to channel Jean's energy, because she didn't have that feeling being pulled, in any direction inside the castle. She was sort of choosing to channel whatever spirit was inside of this bathroom. And then at some point, Patricia appeared to sort of connect with something in the room, something that, Béranger and Remy couldn't see. The room appeared to be empty to them, but it was obvious that Patricia had sort of picked up on something, and then kind of out of nowhere, she said in this very stern, very loud voice, "Jean, show yourself." And then Béranger and Remy, they're staring at Patricia, because again, there's nothing else they can see in this room. And Patricia, she opens her eyes, and she kind of looks around the room, and then she focuses on something on the other side of the bathroom. Like she can clearly see something, like she's seeing another entity or something. Béranger and Remy are looking, and there's nothing they can see. And then Patricia, again, still very focused, eyes locked on whatever it is in the room, she says again in that stern, loud voice, "It's over. You have to move on." Like she's instructing, this entity, presumably Jean's entity, that he needs to go. He needs to move on. And for a second, it's just silent in the bathroom as Béranger and Remy kind of wait to see what's going to happen. Like, is Patricia going to go into another trance here? Like, what's going to happen? But Patricia, she seemed very calm, very forceful, and she's staring still towards the back of the bathroom. Nothing happens. It's silent. And then Patricia again says, "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after the second time that, Patricia is given this command, Béranger and Remy, they heard the sound of banging on a door upstairs on the third floor, basically right above them. And then they hear the sound of shuffling footsteps all over the place, and then the sounds of mournful crying, and there's more banging, and Béranger and Remy, they're holding each other, they're so scared. Patricia's unmoved. She's just standing there, anchored in the room, and all this commotion's happening upstairs, and then suddenly they hear the distinct sound of a door flying open, and then all these footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed in with the sound of crying. But it was not crying like sad. It was blissful crying. It was tears of joy as whoever was up there was charging down the hallway, down the steps, and out of the castle. At this point, it was like a calm fell over the whole castle. And Patricia, she turned away from, whatever else was inside of the bathroom, and she looked at Remy and Béranger, and she smiled, and she said, "It's over. It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia would tell them that she was able to actually channel the ghost that had been in the bathroom, that evil entity. And she said it was Jean. It was his ghost. And that he had been haunting their castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a sort of purgatory where he believed he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. And so every time somebody died inside of this castle over the many, many years that he had been here, he would take their spirit prisoner up in that room on the third floor. Those were prisoners. But Patricia, during this exorcism, had said to him, "It's over. Like, the war is over. It's time to move on." And he understood that she was saying, the war is over. And at that point, Jean is the one who freed the prisoners on the third floor. That was the sound of all the prisoners being released. They were all so happy, and they fled the castle. And then at that point, Jean himself, his spirit, was finally able to rest. However, there's one more wrinkle to the story, which is shortly after the exorcism, when life sort of returned to normal for all parties, Patricia and Béranger were speaking, and Patricia at some point just kind of offhandedly said something like, "It's a good thing, Béranger, that you texted me again and got me to come back out here, because clearly I was able to help you guys. I was able to, free these spirits from the castle. What a good thing it was that you texted me again." And Béranger said, "What do you mean?" And Patricia was like, when you texted me about how the castle was sort of calling me, you were right. Like, clearly it was. And I came over and we took care of it. But Béranger was like, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send that text message." And Patricia, she pulled out her phone and she showed her the text where it was like, "The castle is calling you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Béranger was like, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Béranger, and Remy still have no idea who sent that text to Patricia. Early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlinok stood in the kitchen of her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment making some coffee. Mornings were the best part of Laverne's day because she had the whole apartment to herself. Now, she lived with her boyfriend, John Sosnovsky, but he worked at a nearby mill and had to be out early in order to catch the bus there. And each time he left, Laverne felt like a huge weight lifted off of her. Because when John wasn't home, Laverne could go about her day and pretend she was safe. But that's all it was pretend. John, in reality, was an incredibly violent man. I mean, he was seriously physically abusive, especially when he was drunk, which was basically all the time. So Laverne had actually been married, but her husband had died of cancer, and she had ultimately met John following her husband's death. And so when they met, Laverne was very vulnerable and lonely, and she really hadn't realized the kind of person John was until it was too late. It had been 10 years now, and Laverne still had not, built up the courage to leave him. I mean, the reality was she was just scared of how he would react, and so she sort of felt trapped. Now, she sat down at her kitchen table with her coffee, and she opened up the local paper. And as soon as she did, the first thing she saw was a big black and white photo of a smiling young woman who likely was in her 20s. The photo was connected to an article about a recent murder that happened 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the girl in the photo. The article said she had been beaten and then also strangled with a rope, and then she had been left on the side of the highway. And when Laverne read about the area she actually had been, dumped, she realized it actually was only about 1.5 miles down from this famous scenic overlook that Laverne had actually been to before. Like, she was familiar with this area. And so Laverne, she's reading the article and she's looking at this picture back and forth, and it was like something was sort of forming in her mind. She just had like this weird sense that she knew something about this case. And then as she stared at this photo for a little bit longer, it's like it all came together. And she realized almost certainly that she knew John very likely killed this woman. And so even though she loved her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee, Laverne immediately stood up, she grabbed the phone, and she called the police. After she hung up with police, Laverne was very shaken up. I mean, her heart was still racing. I mean, this was a very risky thing she was doing, because she had no way of knowing if what she had just given authorities was enough to arrest John. If it wasn't, it was entirely possible that John would discover this betrayal of her calling the police about him, implicating him in a murder, and he would probably just continue his abuse, if not amp up his abuse of Laverne. And so the way she saw it is either what she just did was going to end the chapter with John and he was going to go to jail for murder, or Laverne might wind up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week later, on the morning of February 16th, Detective John Ingram sat with his partner in a very clean living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. Ingram was the lead investigator on Tanya Bennett's murder case, and he was there to speak to Laverne, who was sitting on the opposite couch. And Laverne seemed really nervous and kept fidgeting constantly and offering Ingram and his partner refreshments. It was just very clear that there was a lot on this woman's mind. So Ingram knew that Laverne had a week earlier called in a tip about the victim's killer. She thought it was her own boyfriend, John Sosnovsky. And right now, Ingram was very eager to hear what she had to say about her boyfriend, to basically elaborate and sort of give the full story of why she believed what she believed, in part because Ingram's case so far had absolutely no other leads. Like, this was it. The victim's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that you could see her from the road. But Ingram and his partner had not been able to find any witnesses. A few people had claimed to have seen Tanya along with some man at a bar earlier in the night before she went missing, but no one had been able to effectively describe that man. It was just some guy she was with. And so Ingram and his partner had basically talked to just about anyone they could think of that might have known Tanya. They'd canvassed her neighborhood, they'd interviewed her family, co-workers, friends, and they still had not been able to find anybody who fit as a suspect. They also hadn't found any good physical evidence at the scene, like fingerprints or helpful forensics. So now, Ingram was hoping that Laverne was going to be the key to his whole case. And so eventually, Ingram looked at Laverne and said, "Whenever you're ready, tell me what you know. Tell me the story of why you believe John killed Tanya." Now, at first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat, and she was, obviously very nervous, but eventually, after Ingram told her to just, take a breath, calm down, it's okay, we just want to hear your story, eventually, with a shaking voice, she told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home around maybe 1 or 2 in the morning and immediately got in the shower. Now, this was unusual. I mean, this is not something that he typically did. He didn't shower at 2 in the morning, but Laverne really hadn't thought much of it until the next day when they went to a local bar, and she'd literally overheard John bragging to somebody about murdering Tanya, describing how he had picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then took her to the highway by Columbia River Gorge to dump her body by this scenic overlook. As Laverne spoke, Ingram and his partner were shocked. Basically, Laverne had overheard effectively a confession, and the details of that confession did seem to line up with what they had heard so far. Tanya had been seen out late at night with some man, although nobody could really describe the man. And also where her body was found, it was near the scenic overlook, something that was, publicly known, but still, that's what Laverne heard John say. It lined up. But he kept a poker face and just told Laverne to please keep going, keep elaborating. And so Laverne, she continued speaking, and she went on to say that the reason she didn't come forward right away was because she was scared of John. He was a violent alcoholic who abused her, which is also part of the reason why this seemed real to her. She was totally not shocked at the idea that maybe John killed someone, but she was basically fearful that he might kill her too. And so she had kept it to herself until she had seen the article in the paper and also saw the picture of the girl, and she just looked so young and innocent, and she just couldn't help but feel like she owed it to that girl to come forward. Now, at this point, Ingram's mind was whirling. If this was all true, it was huge for this case. Potentially, this just solved the whole murder. This is what happened potentially. But he also knew, right now, it was just one woman's story. He needed actual proof. He couldn't just take Laverne's word for it. So he asked Laverne if he and his partner could just go ahead and search the apartment. And as soon as Laverne nodded, the detectives jumped to their feet and got to work. Laverne led the detectives down the hallway to the master bedroom, and then from there, she backed off and just, let the men get to work. And the detectives, they immediately split up and spread out to cover more ground. Ingram had actually brought along a list of stuff that they were theoretically looking for. And one of the things on his list was a swatch of denim from the front buttons of Tanya's jeans. It had been missing when they found her, like it had been intentionally cut out, which was obviously pretty unusual. And it made him think that Tanya's killer had taken a trophy or something. But after a few minutes of searching around the bedroom, Ingram did not see this denim patch. In fact, he actually didn't see anything at first glance that connected John to Tanya. Until he went over to look through this cardboard box of papers and began sifting through them. And when he pulled out a torn piece of scrap paper and read what was on it, he froze. On this piece of scrap paper was a handwritten message that just said, quote, "T. Bennett, good piece." Ingram immediately called his partner over, who walked over and looked at the note, and both of them are like, okay, obviously, we need to bring John in right away for a chat. But after leaving the bedroom and walking towards the door to leave, who comes in the front door? None other than John Sosnowski. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballinstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballinstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, All you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/Mr. Ballin. Again, that's FANDIEM.com/Mr. Ballin. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. About an hour later, Ingram sat at an interrogation table in the sheriff's office, staring across it at John. And John had a very confused look on his face, but otherwise seemed relatively calm. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in the door and sort of saw the detectives and didn't know what was going on, Ingram had told him who he was and why he was there. And John had really just seemed surprised, but had quickly agreed to go with them to the station if they wanted to speak to him. But Ingram knew from experience that, just because John was acting very cooperative did not mean he was innocent. Now, Ingram slid a picture of Tanya across the table and asked John if he knew who she was or had anything to do with her murder. And John didn't deny it or act horrified or offended to be asked. He just said he didn't really remember. And when Ingram showed him the note they found in his bedroom that said T. Bennett, good peace on it, John just sort of squinted at it and said he really wasn't sure if he wrote that or not. So these were all very straightforward questions, and it was highly suspicious to Ingram that John apparently just couldn't answer them, at least not cleanly. And really the rest of his interview went the same way, with John giving mostly just vague non-answers to everything Ingram asked, no matter how binary the question was supposed to be. And Ingram was just sort of struck by how nonchalant John seemed whenever he responded, even though, he was being questioned about his connection to a murder. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be forthcoming. However, despite Ingram's very high suspicion of John, realistically, the only evidence he had on John, at least at this point, was all circumstantial, and so was not nearly enough to actually arrest John. What they needed in order to do that was some form of hard evidence that directly connected him to Tanya's murder. So ultimately, at the end of this interview, despite how weird the whole thing had been, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now, he could go. 4 days later, Ingram had just gotten to his office for the morning when his desk phone rang. He picked up and was surprised to hear Laverne's voice on the other end. But before he could ask her what this was about, Laverne told him she had found something in her car that morning and felt like he needed to see it. And when she told him what this thing was, Ingram said he would be right over. Then he immediately hung up and ran to find his partner. As he drove to Laverne's, he found his heart was racing. Over the last few days, they hadn't found any additional evidence to prove John was their killer. In fact, if anything, they had actually lost some evidence, since that note they found inside of John's things in his house ended up being a dead end, because their analysts couldn't actually match the handwriting to John, so they didn't know for sure if it was him. But now, based on what Laverne had just told him on the phone about what she found in her car, he was pretty much positive that this was the break he needed. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage with Laverne staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne had told Ingram that she kept her car and really her whole life very, very clean, like her apartment's clean, everything's clean all the time. And when she went into her car that day, she noticed there was a little swatch of denim sitting in the trunk. And she knew that she had not put it there, and considering she was sort of on high alert about John and about his connection to this murder, it just seemed like something worth flagging to police. And for Ingram and his partner, as they're staring into the trunk at this little swatch of denim that looks very much like the swatch of denim they were secretly looking for, they had not publicly revealed that the killer had taken a little swatch of denim from Tanya's jeans. That was private. They're looking at this thinking, oh my goodness, this is the break we needed. Clearly, that's the denim from Tanya's jeans. And so Laverne was right to call this in. This is potentially huge. Now, obviously, Ingram knew that they would still have to get this denim tested to make sure it really was Tanya's. It's entirely possible that it was actually Laverne's or John's or was unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. And so Ingram watched as his partner picked up the swatch, put it into an evidence bag, and then they left and said they would have it tested and they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was at his desk reviewing all the evidence that they had so far. And by this point, they had a lot of evidence. The previous night, after finding the denim, they had brought John in for a polygraph test, and he had completely failed it. The test administrator had even noted that, in his opinion,
John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya. So now, realistically, Ingram was just sort of waiting on confirmation that that fabric was a match. And then at that point, they could go and arrest John. And when Ingram's phone rang, he picked it up immediately, and it was the lab. And so Ingram sat up straight, ready for some good news. But the tech on the other line sounded sort of glum, and he told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya was wearing, so it was not hers. And at this, Ingram was just completely stunned. I mean, the idea that they had just found the same unique cut of denim in a car in their main suspect's house could not be a coincidence. I mean, it was not typical for people to have little swatches of denim lying around. Like, this is not something that you just happen to have. It felt sort of specific. And so there just had to be more to this than met the eye. And even though Ingram tried to work out some kind of reasonable explanation for why that swatch was there, the only thing that actually made sense was that the fake denim was planted there. And so feeling a mix of, again, shock, but also just frustration here. I mean, he thought he was so close to solving this thing, and now he was sort of back to square one. Ingram realized that the next stop had to be Laverne's. He needed to go speak to her again. Later that morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's living room with a very nervous-looking Laverne sitting across from them. This time, Ingram was going to be a little tougher on her, because he now knew that, whatever she had told him before very likely was not the full story. And as soon as Ingram asked Laverne point blank if she had planted that evidence, that denim inside of her car, Laverne just kind of looked back at him and her face began to sort of quiver, and then she just started sobbing. And she told him she was so sorry. She explained that she had cut up some jeans and put that front button part in her car and pretended to have found it so that they'd be able to arrest John. She said she had just gotten so worried when they let him go after interviewing him because she knew John killed Tanya. He had to have. She heard him talk about it. Like, he did it and he's dangerous. And she just wanted to make sure the police held him accountable. Now, when Ingram heard this, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. Like, clearly this woman is scared of John and thinks he did this. She believes he did this. And so he wanted to believe her angle here, as inappropriate as planting evidence was. But, critically, he knew Laverne still was definitely not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that unique cut of the jeans unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other inside information. But there was just something missing here. Why would she randomly choose that front cut of denim as just the evidence? Oh, here's some evidence that's going to make John look guilty. Why would she choose that? That's way too on the nose. And when he pointed this out to Laverne, it was like Laverne's energy completely shifted, from sobbing and sadness and remorse to just pure hesitation. Like, she didn't really know how to react, but there wasn't any more sadness. It was like, uh-oh, something's off here. And then Laverne kind of took a deep breath and she looked at Ingram and she said, I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie. But she went on to say that the reason she had lied was because she had ultimately been too afraid that if the police knew the whole story, that she would get in trouble too. Then Laverne explained what really happened to Tanya. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said John called her that night and he was sort of frantic. And he said to her that he was in trouble and that she needed to meet him at the bar that he was at, and to bring along a shower curtain. And so Laverne said, because she was very scared of John and, was just fearful of asking any questions, she had just done what he said. And she got the shower curtain and she had driven out there and she found John in a parking lot standing over a body. It was Tanya. And she was just lying there on the ground, motionless. Laverne said she was horrified and didn't know what to do, so she just helped. She literally helped John put Tanya's body into her car, Laverne's car, wrapped her up in that curtain she'd brought along, and then together they dumped her body at a spot along the highway. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker, because she actually eventually confessed that actually Tanya had not been dead when she had first arrived, but instead she was still clinging to life. And at John's request, Laverne had tied rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock when she explained this. I mean, here was this gentle, soft-spoken lady who was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of this young woman. It was hard to wrap his head around it. And at the moment, all Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained John's cagey answers to his questions, his failed polygraph, and how Laverne knew the right part of the genes to cut out and fake his evidence. Because she and John had been the ones who actually made the cut on Tanya's genes. They knew. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession here, Ingram wanted to be completely sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was actually the truth. And he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his cruiser next to his partner, and Laverne sat in the back, sort of absent-mindedly staring out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland, and Ingram had instructed Laverne to let him know when they reached the spot where they dumped Tanya's body. Now, the newspapers had published the general location of where the body had been found, but certainly not specifics. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out the exact spot, well, that meant she was telling the truth. As they began to get closer and closer to the spot Ingram knew was the spot, he sort of felt his heart rate pick up, but he didn't drive any faster or slower. He didn't signal that it was coming up. He just kept on driving, steady, going straight, sort of expecting Laverne to call it out any moment. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where the body had been found, and Laverne didn't say anything. For a few minutes, they just kept on driving down the road in total silence, and Ingram's feeling really disappointed here. And as they're driving along, suddenly Laverne says, "Hey, wait a minute, turn around." So Ingram did, and soon they were headed back the way they'd come. And this time, when they passed the actual crime scene, so the actual spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called it out and said that's where she was. Stop. As Ingram parked the car, he looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on that slope right off the highway where the body had been found. Then, once they were parked, all three of them got out of the car, and Laverne went over to the edge of the road and pointed, like right to the exact spot where Tanya had been found on the slope. And even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral here, internally he was sort of amazed. I mean, clearly Laverne was telling the truth. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having prior knowledge of where Tanya had been, meaning she was telling the truth. She must have been involved in killing Tanya. As they all climbed back into the car, Ingram knew they now had more than enough to formally arrest John and also Laverne. She'd done the right thing by coming forward, but of course now there were going to be consequences. On February 21st, so 16 days after Laverne called with her first tip, John Sosnovsky was arrested. And 5 days after that, Laverne was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial started, and at that point, Laverne actually tried to change her story again. She tried to recant her confession and said, "No, I didn't actually do this." But the jury didn't buy her change of heart and convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. As for John, 2 months after Laverne's sentencing, he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And that should have been the end of the case, at least from the legal perspective. But for the next 3 years following sentencing, Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had done, he felt a lot of empathy for her. She'd obviously been under John's control and had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But more than that, Ingram had this horrible, nagging feeling that they'd gotten something wrong here. Then, one March afternoon in 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going over some paperwork when his desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who'd worked Tanya's case. And the prosecutor said they'd just gotten a very strange letter about Tanya's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described the letter's contents, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry that he and his partner and really the whole legal system had potentially just gotten something wrong with this case. It just felt like there was something left unsaid. There was some loophole, there was some loose end something, but he didn't know what it was. It would turn out the thing that was wrong was Laverne. Because their star witness, Laverne, was not just this sweet older lady afraid of her abusive boyfriend who had come forward and told the truth despite the consequences. That wasn't really the story. In fact, basically everything she told Ingram and his partner was a lie. What was true, and what ultimately drove Laverne to do what she did, was she really wanted to break up with John, but she didn't know how to do it. And so what she ultimately did to attempt to rid herself of John was to frame him for murder. And at first, she did an incredible job. She read everything she could, little details about the murder in the news. She also snuck a peek at Ingram's list of evidence during that early interview that was done at her apartment. And so that's how she knew about, that swatch of denim they were looking for. And she also just happened to take a few really lucky guesses. Like when she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she just guessed, but it happened to be right. However, the problem was, despite, basically nailing the framing of John and getting him wrapped up with a murder conviction, she also sort of inadvertently implicated herself. When she came out and said, well, I participated in the murder, her thinking was, they'll take pity on me and they'll blame John, he'll go to jail and I'll be okay. But no, she also got convicted of murder and went to jail as well. And Laverne and John were literally in prison, basically riding out their life sentences, when the actual killer, the real Tanya Bennett killer, sent a letter to authorities confessing to his crime. That was why that prosecutor called Ingram. It was to tell him, I think there's been a mistake. They clearly didn't do it. After the real killer was arrested in 1995, Laverne and John were both released from prison. In total, they both served 4 years in jail, all because of Laverne's lies. One morning in early November of 2023, a 71-year-old woman named Patrice Miller stood in front of her fridge in her little home in the rural town of Downeyville, California, and she saw she was running low on food, which meant it was time to place an order with the market in town, which delivered her groceries for her. Getting her food delivered was essential for Patrice and where she was at in her life right now. She lived alone and had a whole house to take care of, which was definitely getting harder the older she got. She'd also had some health problems lately, so it was getting more difficult just to move around. She even had a walking stick just to prop herself up. As Patrice stood in front of her fridge, wondering what she was going to add to her grocery list, she heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside. And this reminded her that amongst some other chores, she needed to feed her cats. So she decided to make her list later, and she just closed the fridge door, put some cat food in a bowl, and then grabbed her walking stick and headed outside. Patrice carried the cat food out onto the porch. She had some other things to do outside, but she couldn't hold a lot of things at once because of her walking stick. So once she had put the bowl down, she then headed back inside to get her compost, and then took that back outside to her garden. And she tried to do all these outdoor chores really quickly because she didn't like being outside these days. She had lived in Downeyville for a long time, but over the past few years, it had gotten really dangerous there. Now, she hadn't realized how bad it was at first because she mostly kept to herself, but eventually she learned that her neighbors were starting to get intruders on their property. There had also been a clear uptick in vandalism in people's yards and to their homes. And in fact, over the past few months, Patrice herself had begun to experience this directly. In fact, she had dealt with so many attempted break-ins at her own house that she had become convinced that she had a stalker. She'd even put bars on her windows as a security measure. So that's why Patrice did not like being outside. She felt exposed, like her stalker or whoever it was that was doing this was going to be watching her and would come over here and attack. And so as fast as she could, she dumped the compost in her garden, turned around, hustled inside, and shut the door behind her. And as soon as she had done that and was safely inside her house, she felt hugely relieved. A few days later, on November 8th, at the market in town where Patrice typically got her groceries, a 55-year-old cashier named Cassie Koch rang up a customer at the register. But as she bagged their purchases, her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about Patrice. Cassie was typically the person that delivered Patrice's grocery order, But over the years, they had become closer than just a customer-provider relationship. They were friends. In fact, these days, the two of them would speak on the phone fairly often, just to chat. But now, Cassie realized she hadn't heard from Patrice in days, which was very odd, both because of their friendship, but also because she knew it had been a while since Patrice made her grocery order. And so Cassie had begun asking around at the store and had found out that nobody else had heard from Patrice either. Now, Cassie knew it was possible that Patrice was just busy, and for pretty much anybody else, one missed order or even a couple missed orders wouldn't be enough to make Cassie worry. But in this case, Cassie was extra concerned because she knew about Patrice's stalker. And she knew that Patrice had even called the authorities about it, but there really hadn't been much help. Remember, this is a tiny rural town in California that had experienced a lot of exactly what Patrice was experiencing: break-ins, harassment, and other kinds of vandalism or damage. However, neither Patrice nor anybody else had reported any actual violence. So authorities were basically overwhelmed with a flood of what they considered sort of relatively minor complaints. And Patrice's situation really didn't seem much worse than anybody else's in town. And also officials just didn't have the manpower to deal with it. And so ultimately, all authorities did was just advise Patrice on ways she could handle it herself, which was why she'd installed those bars on her windows. All this is to say, Cassie knew that Patrice was genuinely terrified of her stalker, who Patrice referred to as Big Bastard. And she was worried about what the stalker might do next. So after Cassie was done with her shift that day, she tried to get in touch with Patrice one more time. But when she couldn't reach her yet again, Cassie called the police and asked them to go do a wellness check. That evening, a deputy from the Sierra County Sheriff's Department drove up to Patrice's house and parked in front. And immediately, he could tell something was wrong. The front door of her house was clearly smashed in, and there was a garden hose that was laying across her porch steps and was spraying water everywhere, like the water had just been left on. And so the deputy got out of his cruiser and he walked over to the house and he found the turnoff for the water on the side of the house. And then he walked up the front steps of the porch. And as he did this, he was constantly looking around and listening, trying to figure out what was going on here. I mean, he didn't know if there was an active threat inside the house. He had no idea what he was walking into. And so he's on the porch, and before going in through the front door, which was obviously, smashed open, he looked in a window to see if he could see into the house to gauge what was going on here. And when he looked inside the house, the first thing he saw was blood all over the floor. And at that point, he unholstered his gun. And so now, with his gun raised, the deputy stepped into the house. And he slowly walked through the living room, listening for any signs of sudden movement or an indication there was someone still in the house, but he didn't hear anything. And so there didn't appear to be an intruder present right now, but there was also no sign of Patrice. All he saw was that blood towards the front of the house. That was it. And so the deputy, he left the living room and walked towards the kitchen. And as soon as he stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, he breathed in and just kind of held his breath because what he saw was just chaos. All the cabinets were open. And all over the floor were remnants of all the food that likely was in the cabinets, like pieces of food and ripped up packaging and broken jars. A window at the far end of the room was also smashed, and the security bars that Patrice had put on the window were bent and hanging by their hinges. There was actually so much just debris and just chaos in the kitchen that at first the deputy didn't register what was actually laying in the center of the kitchen on the floor. But then, when his brain sort of processed it, he realized what he was looking at was Patrice. At least, what was left of her. But she no longer looked human, because her body had literally been torn apart. The deputy quickly left the house and called in his terrible discovery to the sheriff, and within an hour, Patrice's property was swarming with police and crime scene techs and a forensic expert who specialized in this type of scene, and detectives fanned out all across the area and began speaking to Patrice's neighbors. And because pretty much everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the same type of break-ins and property damage that Patrice had been, it actually didn't take long for police to develop a profile of Patrice's killer. Their conclusion was that very likely the killer was the same individual who was harassing everybody else. But what officials couldn't understand is, why had everybody else experienced effectively minor vandalism, But Patrice went from minor vandalism to really excessive violence, and this required developing a profile of Patrice. And so as police searched for her killer, they were also working on reconstructing Patrice's movements on the final day of her life. And at first, in their efforts, really they were just stumped. I mean, all she had done on that day, as far as they could tell, were some basic chores. But as they dug into what those chores consisted of, they found two things that actually explained everything. It would turn out that every day for the past couple of years, Patrice had been making two terrible mistakes. She fed her cats out on the porch, and she emptied her compost into the garden. And these two actions ultimately were what sort of attracted her stalker, Big Bastard, to her home. Because Big Bastard was a black bear. He loved to eat cat food and kitchen compost scraps. And eventually, he decided that Patrice was food too. So on that day in early November of 2023, when Patrice fed her cats and emptied her compost for the last time, Big Bastard waited until Patrice was in bed and then broke into her house and savagely killed her. By the time the deputy arrived at Patrice's home, Big Bastard had been eating Patrice's body for days. And so what he saw in the kitchen was what was left of her. Black bears are not typically dangerous to people. In fact, Patrice was the first known black bear fatality in California history. But it was exactly that sort of lack of perceived danger, which is why officials didn't help Patrice or any of her other neighbors get rid of these black bears when they were coming into their neighborhood and causing all this property damage and all this alarm. They basically said, what's the worst they could do? One weekday morning in March of 1995, a man named Luther Charles sat on the porch of his parents' house in St. Louis, Missouri, while holding a newspaper. Both of Luther's parents were at work, but Luther was not, because he didn't have a job. In fact, he hadn't had a single job in the last 5 years. So Luther desperately wanted to be an actor professionally. And he'd spent the last 5 years, not working, but auditioning constantly and getting rejected over and over and over again. Now he was totally broke and living with his parents, but he had not lost the dream of wanting to be an actor. Now, Luther knew that a lot of people, at least outside of the acting world, thought that trying to be an actor was sort of a pipe dream. Only chosen few get to do that professionally at a high level. And that he, Luther, should be more realistic and just get a normal job, especially after 5 years of attempts that didn't work out. But he just couldn't bring himself to do that, because for him it was going to be acting or nothing. So on this particular morning, he was doing what he did almost every single day, which was flipping through the classified section of the newspaper, looking for any open calls for auditions. And as he scanned the page he was on, he saw one that caught his eye. It was for a musical that was being produced several hundred miles away in Ohio, but they had an open call for auditions that night. Now, at first, Luther was kind of confused about why producers from Ohio would place a call for auditions in a newspaper in Missouri. But then he saw that it was because these producers were trying to find a very specific kind of actor for what sounded like a very unique character. And Luther realized he could be what they were looking for. This could finally be his chance to get his big break. This was, of course, not going to be easy. Number one, he would have to drive today all the way to Ohio just to do this audition. But two, what it would take for him to get into this character, to do a good job and hopefully land this part, was going to take a lot. But after 5 years of near constant rejection, he was willing to try anything. A few minutes later, Luther got into the driver's seat of his car. He was carrying 3 things with him: a map to help him get to Ohio, an entire bottle of whiskey to help him be brave, and a hacksaw to help him get into character. That evening in Ohio, one of the producers of this musical sat in the front row of an empty auditorium. She'd spent the last several hours listening to hopeful actors read monologues and sing songs, and she knew there were still more people waiting to audition. So she called for the next person in line to come inside. And a moment later, a man stumbled out onto the stage, and when the producer saw him, she was just confused. because he seemed very wobbly, almost like he was drunk, and he had on this weird sort of costume where he had bandages wrapped around his head. And then, in a very slurred voice, this man said his name was Luther Charles, and he knew that this musical required a very specific kind of actor, and he had made sure that he was perfect for this part. The producer didn't understand what Luther was talking about, though. But before she could clarify, Luther, on stage, began unwrapping the bandages from his head. And when the producer saw what was underneath them, she began screaming for help. It would turn out that casting call in the newspaper that Luther read that inspired him to go here and do this contained a very unfortunate typo. What the producers of the musical were looking for were genuine, fearless actors. But what actually got printed was a call for, quote, genuine, earless actors. And Luther Charles was so desperate to land a role that he drove to Ohio, downed a bottle of whiskey, and then cut off both of his ears with that hacksaw, because he believed it would make him perfect for this musical. Luther survived his self-inflicted injuries and later underwent psychiatric treatment. He did not, however, get the part. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. The strangest part isn't coming home. It's realizing you came back, but your mind didn't. You're trying to move through life doing everything right, work, family, responsibilities. But small moments feel off, and later you're left thinking, what's wrong with me? I also went through these exact same feelings when I left the military. My mind was very conflicted because the world sort of expected me to be normal, but it was like my nervous system still expected danger all the time. Trauma doesn't stay back there. It rewires you. It changes how you react, how you trust, how you love. But therapy can help break that pattern. BetterHelp makes that support easier to access. You fill out a short questionnaire and get matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime. Join the 6 million plus people who have gotten help from BetterHelp, the platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On an evening in October of 2003, a woman named Tina carried a grocery bag down the hallway of a big apartment building in Harlem, New York. The hallway was narrow, with white tile walls and heavy metal doors and overhead lights that flickered. And as Tina stopped in front of her door, she caught a whiff of a familiar smell coming from across the hall in apartment 5E. It smelled like urine and rotting meat. Tina grimaced, but quickly set down her grocery bag and began sifting through her purse for her keys. But right as she found them, she heard footsteps coming down the hall behind her. She turned, and when she saw who was walking up the hallway towards her, she began to panic because it was Antoine Yates, the owner of apartment 5E, the stinky apartment. He was coming right down the hall, and he was carrying what appeared to be this huge sack that maybe looked like it was filled with sand or something. She didn't care, but she did not want to be near this guy. And so as fast as she could, she put the key in the door, opened it up, flew inside, grabbed her groceries, shut the door, and deadbolted it. Now, Tina did feel sort of guilty about being really obviously rude towards Antoine. I mean, Antoine had lived in this building for years, and at one point she had thought he was a nice guy. But lately, he'd gotten really weird, and she no longer wanted anything to do with him. First of all, there was that horrific smell coming from his apartment basically at all hours. And then there was the fact that Antoine basically stopped leaving the apartment altogether. Like he was basically in his apartment 24/7. As far as Tina could tell, he maybe left once a day, tops, for maybe like an hour a day. But other than that, he was like a constant presence across the hall. But beyond the smell and his reclusive nature, the most sort of alarming aspect of his recent weird behavior were all the random loud crashing sounds that Tina would hear coming from Antoine's apartment at all hours, even though from what she could tell, he didn't have any visitors ever. It was just him in there. Now, Tina had no idea what Antoine was doing in there, but she assumed whatever it wasn't good, but it wasn't her business. And so she decided that the best thing she could do was just stay in her apartment, make sure the door was locked, and hope at some point he stopped doing whatever it was he was doing. A couple days later, Tina went down to the lobby to check her mail. And when she did, she ran into a woman named Joyce who lived in apartment 4E, which was directly below Antoine's apartment. Tina said hello to her, and as she opened up her mailbox, Joyce came over and stood next to her with this sort of strange look on her face. Tina picked up on it and asked her what was wrong. And Joyce told her that last night she'd noticed liquid dripping down through her ceiling. And at first she thought it was maybe a burst pipe or an overflowing sink. But when she got a rag and went to clean it up, she realized it wasn't water. It smelled like pee. Then Joyce, she lowered her voice and leaned in close to Tina. And she said the pee wasn't the only weird thing. Sometimes late at night, when the building was quiet, she said she could hear what sounded like whimpering coming from the upstairs apartment, Antoine's apartment. And at this, Tina's heart began to pound. Now, she had tried to just kind of, mentally and physically avoid the whole Antoine situation, whatever it was. But now that she knew other neighbors were also noticing bizarre things like she was, she felt like she had to act. And so Tina said to Joyce that, you know what, we really ought to call the housing authority and see if they'd come out and investigate to see what was going on. But Joyce said she'd already tried that. She'd called multiple times, and so far, nobody had done anything. So Tina told Joyce that, okay, well, let's all get together, all the other neighbors, and go to the housing authority as a group. And maybe then they'd be taken more seriously. Joyce liked the idea, so the two women exchanged numbers, and then Tina went back up to her apartment. But the next day, before Tina had time to chat with any more neighbors, she came home from the store and walked into the lobby of the apartment building, and she saw Antoine on the floor of the lobby screaming in pain with two police officers huddled over him. He had these gaping wounds all over his arm and his leg, and there was blood all over the tile floor. Tina didn't know what to do, so she just hustled right past them through the lobby, made her way upstairs, and got inside her apartment. But once she was inside, her curiosity got the best of her, and she ran to the window to see if there was anything going on outside that could begin to explain what was going on with Antoine. And outside, she saw an ambulance pull up, and then moments later, paramedics loaded Antoine into the back of it, and they took off. After that, Tina basically sat there expecting any moment for the police to come barreling down the hallway and break down Antoine's door, apartment 5E, to finally put an end to whatever was happening inside of there. But she sat there waiting for an hour, and she didn't hear anything. And then finally, after, about an hour, she saw those two police officers from the lobby get back in their squad car and drive away. Tina was shocked. She had no idea what happened to Antoine, but she also couldn't conceptualize of what Antoine would have told those officers that would make them think they should just leave without checking his apartment. And so Tina felt like she couldn't just sit here and do nothing, like somebody needed to go in there. Tina didn't know if maybe Antoine was hurting someone in his apartment and they had finally fought back, that's why he was all cut up, or maybe if he was involved in some kind of violent criminal activity or what, but it was clearly never going to end unless she spoke up. So, as much as it terrified her to get involved here, she picked up the phone, called the police, and told them everything she had seen and heard. The next day, Tina was coming home from work when she saw this huge crowd gathered outside her apartment building. Hundreds of her neighbors were just standing on the sidewalk looking up at the side of the building. And when Tina looked up, she saw what they were watching. A police officer was rappelling down the side of this building from one of the upper levels, and with him he had this big rifle and some other huge weapon, and he was slowly making his way down. But then he eventually stopped right outside a 5th floor window. And Tina realized he was stopping outside of Antoine's window. That was his apartment. And so Tina and the others watched as this officer began to tap on the glass of the window. And then there was this huge explosion of glass that flew outwards, like the window had broken, but from the inside going out. That officer immediately raised his rifle and began firing into the apartment while also signaling to the police officers above him, leaning out of another apartment to pull him up. And they immediately began pulling him up. And then a few minutes later, a half dozen more police officers came running out the front door of the apartment building, and they were carrying this massive tarp between them, with something obviously very heavy and large inside of it. Now, none of this made any sense to Tina until the officers passed by her and she caught a glimpse of what was in the tarp. It would turn out Tina and Joyce were right to be suspicious of Antoine. But it wasn't because he was a violent criminal who was secretly hurting people in his apartment. No, his secret was actually much weirder. Antoine had a very strange pet. Specifically, he had a 400-pound tiger named Ming, who had been living in Antoine's apartment for years. It slept in one of his bedrooms with a giant sand pit. It peed basically everywhere, and it lived off raw meat. Antoine's horrible wounds that day were caused by Ming biting him when Antoine tried to stop the tiger from pouncing on one of his other pets, a stray kitten that he had taken in. As for Antoine and Ming, they both survived this encounter. Antoine was ultimately arrested for reckless endangerment, and Ming, who was just tranquilized during that exchange with the police officer, was carried out of the apartment and taken to a sanctuary in Ohio. Also, that stray kitten survived the attack as well. At 2:45 p.m. on January 6, 1995, a 45-year-old man named MacArthur Wheeler walked towards the front doors of a bank in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a small town near Pittsburgh. MacArthur had on a mask and was dressed in a big blue parka, and in one of his pockets, he was carrying a semi-automatic handgun. MacArthur was about to rob this bank at gunpoint, but weirdly, he did not feel nervous, despite the fact that, MacArthur had never robbed a bank before. But one of his friends, 43-year-old Clifton Johnson, had. And Clifton was already inside the bank, waiting in line and pretending to be a customer, even though he was actually MacArthur's co-conspirator. MacArthur and Clifton had spent days planning out this robbery together, down to every last detail. And even though MacArthur had been kind of scared at first, Clifton had talked him through every possible scenario and made sure that they had a plan for everything that could go wrong. So now, MacArthur was 100% confident that they were going to get away with this, which again is why he was not nervous. So, this day, MacArthur walked up to the bank's doors and went inside. He had to squint through his mask because it obscured his view a little bit, but he saw Clifton standing in line, which immediately gave him another burst of confidence to actually see Clifton. He was here. So far, things were going exactly as planned. And so MacArthur quickly pushed his way through the line, and he locked eyes with the bank teller. And as he did, he pulled out his gun, he aimed it at them, and he told them to hand over all the money. MacArthur heard the sound of other people in the bank, other patrons and other staff beginning to gasp because they're seeing what's happening here. And so MacArthur quickly turned around with his gun still in his hand, and he told everybody that he didn't want to hurt anyone. Everybody just needed to stay calm, and as soon as he got the money, he'd be gone. Then MacArthur turned back to the teller, who by this point had gathered up all the cash in the register and was literally just holding it out, like, here, take it. And MacArthur, he grabbed the cash, put it in one of his pockets, he put his gun back inside of his pocket, then he looked over at Clifton, and the two men nodded, and then they turned and ran out of the bank. About 3 months later, in the early morning hours of April 20th, 1995, MacArthur was sleeping inside his apartment just outside of Pittsburgh. After the robbery, he and Clifton had escaped with a little over $5,000, and they'd gone their separate ways in order to lay low. So they weren't really in contact, but to MacArthur, it seemed like everything had worked out perfectly, because here he was, still a free man with all this cash, and the cops hadn't even shown up once to question him. But on this particular night, a pounding on MacArthur's door woke him up, and he bolted upright in bed, and he heard somebody yell at him to open up, because it was the police. Now at this point, MacArthur was definitely nervous. However, he sort of calmed himself down and told himself that right now his best option was just to play it cool. Because even if the cops suspected him in that robbery, there was simply no way they could possibly prove he'd actually done it. He'd been wearing a mask and a huge parka that totally obscured his identity. So MacArthur, he got out of bed and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and sure enough, there's all these police officers standing in the doorway. And MacArthur pretended to act confused and asked them, what's going on here? And that was when one of the officers told MacArthur he was under arrest for armed robbery, and then showed him a printed photo from one of the bank's security cameras, and clear as day, there he was. So this photo clearly showed MacArthur's face. Every detail was perfectly visible. It was him, for sure. He didn't even look like he was wearing a mask. But MacArthur couldn't wrap his mind around how this was possible. He looked from the picture up to the cops and just said, "But I wore the juice." It would turn out the mask MacArthur was wearing during this robbery was not a ski mask or a Halloween mask or really a mask in any traditional sense of the word. What MacArthur and his co-conspirator Clifton had both done, and what they truly thought would disguise their identities completely, was rub lemon juice on their faces. They believed that lemon juice would essentially act as a mask and make them literally invisible to security cameras. Unfortunately, though, lemon juice does not make you invisible. And so once the police accessed the bank's security footage, they saw clear as day MacArthur and Clifton committing this crime, and they arrested them both. Clifton was sentenced to 5 years in prison for armed bank robbery, and MacArthur was sentenced to 22.5 years. But this was not the end of the story, because Clifton and MacArthur's ridiculous crime made headlines. And before long, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University read about it, and it made him realize something. The fact that MacArthur literally believed lemon juice would make him invisible, and he acted on that knowledge, or that supposed knowledge, to commit this crime, and then was shocked when it didn't work, that suggests a level of stupidity that is just exceptionally high. So high that this professor began to wonder if maybe MacArthur is so stupid, he actually doesn't understand how stupid he really was. And so this led the professor to research this idea, and he ultimately established a new psychological concept that we now call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which essentially says that the more incompetent a person is at something, the less likely they are to recognize their own incompetence. Basically, the dumber you are, the more confident you become.
Around 10 a.m. on March 18, 1944, a 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Aimo Koivunen sat around a campfire with a group of other soldiers inside of the Arctic Circle in Northern Europe. They were very deep into the wilderness in this forest that was covered in several feet of snow. And Aimo was melting a pot of that snow over the fire so the group could drink some tea. And at the same time that Aimo was doing this, even though it was kind of relaxing to be sitting here, Aimo, his whole body was basically aching. Number one, it was 5 degrees outside, and this was also the first time that he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in about 2 days. They had been on the move the whole time. So Aimo and his squadron were all members of the Finnish military. And at this point, during World War II, they were actually allied with Nazi Germany. Not because, they were Nazis, they were not, but because Finland and Germany shared a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Aimo and his squadron were in an area called Lapland, which used to belong to Finland. But 4 years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Finland and ultimately forced Finland to cede this land to the Soviets. But now, during World War II, Finland wanted to get their land back, and Germany was helping them do that. And so Aimo and his squadron were in Lapland on essentially a reconnaissance mission. They were there to try to figure out sort of what the Soviets were doing in this part of Lapland and how many Soviets were out there, again, in this particular part of Lapland. However, Aimo and the others had spent the past 2 days skiing all over the place in their area of operations, but so far, they hadn't seen any Soviet soldiers or any Soviet bases. But, for Aimo, and probably for the other soldiers that he was with, this was ultimately a good thing. They were trained for combat, but they didn't necessarily want to come across Soviets and have like a full-blown shootout, in part because the Soviets were just a bigger, more well-equipped military. And, they were also more advanced. And so if they got into a gunfight with them, who knows what would have happened. And so even though IMO is like sitting here feeling very sore and very tired as he melts his snow, he was ultimately feeling kind of grateful that this reconnaissance mission had proven to be pretty low key. However, just as the water began to boil, IMO and the other soldiers heard the unmistakable sound of machine gun fire coming from somewhere that had to be nearby. And so immediately, IMO and the others, they jump up, forget what they're doing, and they're looking to see where this gunfire is coming from. But then before they could even make sense of the situation, IMO's lieutenant yelled like, "Hey, get ready, get your guns." And so they all scooped up their weapons. IMO, he's picking his weapon up, and as he looks up, he looked off in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, and he was shocked to see an entire pack of Soviet soldiers bearing down on them. They were literally skiing down this mountainside right nearby, and they were obviously shooting their machine guns, not in random directions, but right at IMO and the other men. They were clearly being attacked by these Soviets. Now, IMO and the other men have clearly been trained for this. This is literally why they're out here. They are soldiers. They're ready for this type of encounter. But for a moment, when IMO sees this overwhelming force that's descending on them, they're clearly outnumbered, like this is going to end badly. All IMO had in his head was just this overwhelming feeling of just terror. He was the oldest of 6 children, and when he first enlisted in the military, he had promised all of his little siblings that he wouldn't get hurt, he would come home, he would be okay. And now he knew that wasn't going to happen, like he was going to get killed, he just knew it. But IMO, after sort of breaking out of this initial thought, he looked over at his lieutenant, and his lieutenant looked terrified too, but he quickly composed himself and yelled for IMO and everybody else to flee. Just moments later, IMO and the other Finnish soldiers were on their skis, skiing as fast as they could away from the Soviets down the backside of this mountain, just doing anything they could to survive. And as IMO is skiing away, he can hear the sound of gunfire ricocheting off trees, zipping by his head. Like he's thinking, at any point, I'm going to get hit, or one of my teammates are going to get hit. There's nothing we can do. We just got to go as fast and as far as we can. And so he's skiing, and actually IMO was at the front of their formation. So he's actually leading the pack. And so really it was his job to kind of create tracks in the snow that the others could follow in behind. It was easier for them. But it meant he was expending a lot of energy, basically pushing all the snow down as he was making his escape. And as much as he wanted to maintain that position and do this for his teammates, to continue to make tracks here, it was so exhausting. And also, like when you're in combat, you have this unbelievable adrenaline rush that sometimes can lead to like a massive crash of energy. And it was like he had this huge rush of energy, and now it's like he's collapsing despite the need to escape here. It's like his body just cannot go any faster than he's going. And so before long, it's like he found himself slowing down, and his teammates are zipping by him because they can't stop. The bullets are flying fast, like their only hope of survival is just to keep on going. And so IMO knows that, like, basically, if he can't keep up, he's dead. But his body, it was just he couldn't go any faster. He was slowing down. He was going slower and slower. He can hear the sound of the gunfire getting closer and closer, and he's thinking about his siblings and how devastated they're going to be to find out that he was killed in this war. And so slower and slower he's going. The sounds are getting louder and louder behind him, and he sees the last of his teammates pass him, and he sees them just kind of drift off down the mountain into the white abyss beyond, and they're gone. He's alone, and he just can't keep up. And then finally he just loses control of his skis. He veers off to the side. He starts tumbling down the mountain, smashes into a tree, and he passes out. When IMO woke up, it was light outside. But he had no idea how much time had passed. He also really had no idea how he was even still alive. Like, what, did the Soviets just decide not to kill me? Or did they not see me? Like, what happened to my teammates? Like, what's going on? He had a lot of questions. But in addition to feeling confused about the whole situation, he also had this really distinct other feeling. He had this immense sense of being alert, like hyper alert, more than really he had ever been in his whole life. It's like he could hear and see everything at like a 10 times level. It's like, oh my God, I know everything going on around me. I'm totally aware. So with his like hypervigilance that he suddenly was having sort of out of nowhere, he began to, take stock of his situation. Right away, he, was able to see that he's alone. Like the Soviets are not nearby. He's not like being held captive. And again, his comrades are nowhere to be seen. So he's alone in the middle of the wilderness in the Arctic Circle. But he also could see that, okay, well, I still have my skis, so I can still get around. He still had his boots on. He still had his equipment on. Like he had the things he needed to survive. He even had his compass still, which had been in his hand, but he hadn't lost it. And so he had a way to navigate. And he had his weapon still. And so he's thinking, okay, like the situation's bad, but I have what I need to survive for some time. And he also realized that sort of amazingly, despite clearly crashing as a minimum and smashing into this tree that he was laying near, despite that, he didn't feel any pain in his body. And he didn't appear to have any injuries. So he's thinking, what a miracle here, that the worst thing that's happened here is I've basically been abandoned and I'm effectively lost, but it could be worse. And so Imo, after, taking stock of his situation, he eventually stood up and he looked off into the distance and he saw maybe 6 or 7 miles away, there was smoke up on this mountain off in the distance. And he immediately recognized that mountain was actually what appeared to be the rendezvous point for he and his squadron if they ever got separated. And so he's looking out at this mountain and seeing, the signs of potential life over there. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, those are my teammates. That's where they've gone. They've gone to the rendezvous point. All I need to do is go to that mountain. So Imo scooped up his backpack and picked up his gun and whatever other equipment he had on the ground. And then he started skiing towards this mountain. And for a while, he just kept on staring up at the smoke coming off the mountain, making sure he was going in the right direction. And, as he got closer, he was nearly positive he could see that in addition to the smoke, he could see what appeared to be little lean-to tents on the mountainside, which were telltale signs that those were Finnish soldiers. That's how they set up their tents. So he's thinking, this is it. Like, I'm going to be saved. I just got to get there. And he had so much energy, maybe because he was so close to being rescued or something. But he felt like this huge surge of energy. It was like nothing could make him tired. And then finally, Imo got close enough to this campsite on the side of this mountain that he actually could see faces. He could see the other soldiers, and they were his, Finnish comrades. They had clearly gone to the rendezvous point, and they hadn't seen him yet. And so here he is, feeling like full of energy. He's barreling towards them, and he starts calling out to them. He's thinking they're going to be like totally shocked that, anybody would just come out of the wilderness towards their campsite, let alone Imo, who they must have assumed by this point was dead. Also, he's thinking, I don't want them to shoot at me, thinking I'm a Soviet soldier, so I better get their attention. And so he's yelling out for his comrades. And at some point, one of the men, they turn and they see Imo, and their reaction is not what Imo wanted. Their reaction was being really shocked, grabbing their weapon and shooting at him. And before long, all these soldiers, all of his comrades, are opening fire on Imo. And Imo's like, come on, like, I'm one of you, what are you doing? But he's already going so fast, skiing so fast, that his only move was to basically ski right down the middle of their camp and just go to the other side of the mountain. And so he literally skied through this campsite with all of his comrades shooting at him, who miraculously missed him, so he doesn't get shot somehow. The bullets are whizzing past his head, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, they think I'm a Soviet. Come on, I'm calling out to you guys. I'm not a Soviet. But he barrels past them, and then after he's pretty far away from this campsite, he's yelling back to them like, guys, it's me, it's Imo, what are you doing? But they're yelling and they're shooting in his direction. And so he had no choice but to just keep on skiing away from them, away from safety, or what he believed was going to be safety. And so on he went for hours and hours, just skiing and skiing away from this ambush, if you will. And the whole time he's thinking, like, what happened? Even if they shot at me at first, couldn't they have figured it out that, like, I'm one of you? Like, wouldn't you have realized that eventually as I skied right through your campsite? I have the same uniform as you. I have the same weapon as you. You recognize me? Like, what was that? And so he has no idea what happened, but he's like, how do I have so much energy? Like, how am I able to do this? I've been skiing for hours and hours and hours. I've been shot at so many times. Like, this is surreal. What's happening? Like, what is going on here? And so Aimo just continued skiing for hours and hours until it was abundantly clear he was not in shooting range. He didn't hear the sound of any gunfire. Like, he's safe again. Still very confused why this was even happening, but he's safe. You know, the sun's gone down, and so he thinks, like, okay, I need to stop. I need to make camp. I need to regroup. But it was at this point that he's thinking to himself, like, I haven't eaten anything. I haven't had any water. I've basically been at a full sprint, like skiing at a full sprint here for practically the whole day. I've had multiple near-death experiences. I smashed into a tree during that initial, skirmish. But I feel great. I feel like I have more energy than I've ever had in my whole life. And so he's just caught by, like, how am I able to do this? Is this what it's like when you're in a true survival situation? Like your body just goes into like overdrive or something? Like he couldn't understand it. And so he's standing there, like, basically telling himself, you really need to stop. Even though you have the energy to go pretty much indefinitely, you need to stop, you need to make a fire, you need to have food, you need to have water, you need to rest. But it was like he was forcing himself to do these things. He didn't feel compelled to do them. It was like, oh, that's right, I need to, like, do human stuff. And so that's what he did. He stopped, he built a fire, he made some food, and he's, like, not hungry at all, but he's eating the food, forcing himself to. He's having some water. And then he said, okay, I'll rest, and then in the morning I'll figure out what to do next. But he lays down to go to sleep, and he should have been completely exhausted, but he wasn't. He couldn't even sleep, like, not at all. He just laid there completely wide awake as the wind and sleet and snow whipped all around him, and he just laid there, again, feeling great, but just not tired at all. The next morning, when the sun came up, Aimo had not slept at all, but still he was able to get up, put his skis on, and get his stuff and continue skiing, basically in the direction that he believed would bring him back to Finland. And as he was skiing, he's thinking to himself, it's kind of interesting because when he first got attacked by the Soviets, it was like his mind was clear, but his body failed him. Like, his legs got so tired from trying to cut those tracks in the snow that he fell off and crashed. And that sort of led him to this position. But now, for whatever reason, it was like his mind was delirious. Like, he couldn't keep his thoughts straight, but his body was like a Terminator. Like, he just kept on going no matter what. And so he just kept on skiing, almost like without even thinking. His body was like on autopilot. And so he skied for hours and hours and hours just in this one direction that he sort of loosely believed would bring him back to Finland. And the whole time he's skiing, he didn't see another soul. He is out in the middle of, the Arctic Circle. There's no more Soviets. There's no more teammates, nothing. He's just out in the middle of the wilderness. And realistically, he didn't know if he was even remotely going in the right direction, but he was just going to go. But that night, as he's still just skiing in a straight line, not stopping, sort of unbelievably, he looked up ahead and he saw somebody. The first person he had seen since, the ambush at the campsite. And even more unbelievable is the person he saw was one of his teammates. It was this guy named Matty. He was a comrade of his. They had been together when the Soviets had first attacked. And so immediately Aimo's thinking, like, clearly Matty got separated as well, and it's just serendipity that we have wound up at the same place. And so Aimo, he skis right up to Matty, and he's waving him down. He's so relieved to see him. And Matty, when he looks over at Aimo, he doesn't shoot at him, but he sort of tells him to, like, be quiet, like, calm down. And he kind of beckons him over. And when Aimo comes up next to Matty, he has all these questions, like, what do we do? Where are we going? But Matty just tells him, like, just to be quiet, and then gestures to lay down on the ground. And so Aimo doesn't really know what's going on here, but he trusts Matty. Matty is not shooting at him. That was a good sign. And so the two of them just laid in the snow. They laid down right there. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Aimo was able to feel tired enough that when he closed his eyes, he did drift off to sleep almost right away. When Aimo woke back up again, he was not lying down in the snow with Matty. He was instead standing up on his skis, skiing down a mountain, like on a mission. Matty's nowhere to be found. And on top of that, he didn't have his backpack and he didn't have his gun. Had no idea how long he'd been skiing for. He didn't know like where he was going. It was like he went from passed out to skiing, just magically skiing. Now, realistically, at this point, IMO is thinking to himself, clearly what's happening here is I'm like hallucinating or something. Because how is it possible that I was just with Maddie laying on the ground sleeping and now I'm here? Like, it didn't add up. And so as he's just sort of mindlessly skiing along, he's like telling himself like, this is you dying. Like, this is you losing your mind before you die. Like your mind is all over the place. Your body's still going for reasons he didn't really understand. Still at, full tilt, full energy, didn't know why. But at some point that's going to give out and you're just going to die. Like, that's what's going to happen here. And so Aimo's only hope was that between now and when he died, that hopefully somebody would see him and save him. He knew it was an outside chance, but at this point, that's all he had. And so on he skied. No weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He's basically operating on no sleep, and he's just skiing. And for days and days, he doesn't stop. He can't believe his body is keeping up as well as it is. His mind is like totally gone, but he is just going for days and days and days. Doesn't run into anyone. But then one day, again, days later, he's skiing along and magically almost in front of him appears this building. He can't tell if it's necessarily a military outpost or civilian. He doesn't know if it's Finnish or German or Soviet. But he knows, even in his totally fractured mental state, that attempting to go in that building and hoping there are people in there that will save him, even if they won't, even if they kill him maybe, that is a better outcome, a better choice than doing what he's doing right now, which is the sort of endless ski to his death. And so Aimo starts skiing faster and faster towards this building, just like full reckless abandon, fully committed to this is my rescue or this is my death. And as he gets closer, he sees, sort of unbelievably, that this is a military installation, and it is a German military installation. And remember, the Finnish are allied with the Germans at this point, and so this is a safe place for him. And so he's so relieved, he can't believe he's going to potentially survive this thing. He takes off his skis, and he starts running towards the front door of this building. But before he gets to the front door, he steps on something, and then there was a loud bang, and he's thrown into the air and comes crashing down. And when Aimo opened his eyes and sort of took stock of what had happened, he didn't feel any pain, but he looked down and he saw his foot was just a bloody mess. There was literally bones poking out of his ankle. Like he could see, clearly he sustained a horrible injury, and he must have just stepped on a landmine. But Aimo, determined to get into that building, he pulled himself up, again, sort of channeling this unbelievable just endurance he had been feeling the past several days that he'd been out here. He stood up and on one foot began hobbling his way towards this installation. And he finally gets to the front door of this German military base. And he grabs the doorknob and he's about to open it when there's another banging sound and he's thrown again into the air. He had stepped on another landmine. And he comes smashing down, and he doesn't die, he doesn't feel any pain, but he looks down at his legs, and he sees his other leg that was not injured a minute ago is now also mangled. So now he can't even stand. He's incapacitated. And on top of that, even though he's near this military outpost, he turns and looks at it, and now that he's a little bit closer and he's sort of looking more, intentionally at this building, he realizes it's abandoned. Like, this isn't going to save him. He's trapped. He's in the middle of nowhere, and there's no one here. And so at this point, Aimo just said, you know what? It's over. Like, I'm going to die. And so he literally just crawled his way over to this nearby ditch, let himself roll into it, and he just waited to die. He just knew it was over. But he didn't die. For days, he just laid in this ditch, like, unable to die. He wanted to die. He wanted this to be over. Like, what else is he going to do? Who's going to save him? But he just watched the sun come up and set, go up, set, over and over and over. He lost track of how many days he was just laying there. Again, bleeding profusely, like grievously injured. He hasn't eaten anything. He hasn't had any water. Like, he can't believe he's still alive. He really can't believe it. And then as he's laying there, one of these days he's just in this ditch. He looks up during the daytime and he sees what looks like a plane flying overhead. Now, at this point, Imo is in very bad shape. I mean, he's alive, but it's not going well. And he knows that, so he doesn't know if he's hallucinating this or what, but he felt like it was real. But after watching this plane circle overhead for a minute, Imo was almost certain he heard the sound of this plane landing nearby. And then a couple of minutes later, he could have sworn from the ditch, he can't really see anything, he could hear the sound of people speaking in Finnish, his native language. Again, he didn't know if he was hallucinating or not, but he sees this head poke over the top of the ditch. And it was this young man, this young Finnish guy, and he's looking down at Imo, and Imo's looking back up at him. And then a second later, Imo was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, Imo found himself laying in a hospital bed inside of a hospital in Finland. Like the man in the plane, all that, not a hallucination. He really had been rescued. And once he was at the hospital, it turned out he weighed just 94 pounds. He was also badly burned and frostbitten, and both of his legs were very badly mutilated and mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, despite the fact he's just laying in bed, not doing anything. And even more crazy was they couldn't actually get his heart to slow down. It just kept beating at this crazy high level. Now, at first, doctors and nurses and all the staff were really shocked by Imo's condition. Not really just that he had survived, but again, his heart rate. It just seemed like, dude, how are you alive right now? Your heart can't beat at this level for this long without eventually killing you. But after they spoke to Imo and had him recount the whole ordeal of him being out, getting shot at and lost and the whole thing, they learned one really specific thing that explained the whole thing. When Imo and his, Finnish comrades were initially ambushed by the Soviet soldiers, they decided to flee. But Imo, he was having such a hard time physically keeping up with the other soldiers. He was just getting so tired from trying to break the tracks, and then he fell off, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't find a way to keep up, I'm gonna get captured or get killed by the Soviets. And so he's desperate. And so before he ultimately crashed down the side of the mountain from exhaustion, he tried something to try to give himself some energy, to try to make this escape. He pulled out these special military rations that he had been issued, along with everybody else in his squadron. They were all given these rations. And the reason you take these rations is to give yourself some energy. And so he takes these rations, and he's thinking, this is going to do it. This is going to give me the boost I need to get out of here and make the escape with my teammates. But the rations didn't work. And so he did sort of completely fall off. He was so tired to the point where he literally tumbled down the side of the mountain. His teammates, they skied off, and he smashes into a tree, and he passes out. However, when Imo woke up, one, he was amazed he had not been captured or killed by the Soviets, but he's realizing he's all alone and what's going to happen to me? And then he starts to feel man, I just have a lot of energy. I can see and perceive things on a level that I couldn't before. Well, that's because the military rations had kicked in. And now he had this abundance of energy. And it allowed him to basically ski indefinitely without sleeping, without having water, without food. He gets blown up twice. His feet have been blown off, basically. He's laying in a ditch dying, but he just can't seem to die. The guy should have died several times, but these rations did their job. They gave him all the energy he needed to survive this crazy, crazy 2 weeks in the wild. Well, the military rations, they're called Pervitin. And this drug, I don't know if it's still given to soldiers now, but probably not, because effectively what Pervitin is just pure crystal meth. And so in essence, Imo survived in the wild for all this time because he was on just a pure meth-fueled rage. He was just completely high for 2 weeks, and it saved his life. One thing to note about Pervitin is it does have two distinct downsides. One, it is incredibly addictive, and two, it creates really, really intense hallucinations. And so very likely, he did not come across his own battalion who then opened fire on him. He did not come across Maddie, his teammate out in the wild who told him to lay down. And who knows, we're not even sure if the military installation he saw was real. Like, very likely all of that was just in his mind. However, the landmines, those were real. Somewhat unbelievably, IMO would make a full recovery, and he would go on to get married, he would have 9 children, and he would live to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that did save his life, he never took Pervitin again.